Today in geography class, we're going to build on our understanding of Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands by learning the geography skill or the critical thinking skill of making generalizations and relate that to what we learned in geography about this region in the Ring of Fire that brings all sorts of different types of tectonic activity, volcanic eruption, and earthquake into the region that we're studying, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. Now, the skill that we're looking at is called making generalizations. Let's go about learning the skill, practicing the skill, and applying the skill in today's lesson. We're going to begin by reading. When you make generalizations, you take specific information and use reasoning to come up with a general or non-specific concept that unites the information. When making generalizations, you look at what the things, concepts, or ideas have in common with one another. For example, if you are studying a group of dogs, you could make the correct generalization that dogs have 4 legs, fur, and sharp teeth. Basically, to make a generalization is to take information, synthesize it, think about it, and then put it together where it has commonality. Generalizations should be made with care, however. If you do not have enough information or data, you may make an incorrect generalization. For example, if the group of dogs included only toy poodles, miniature schnauzers, and chihuahuas, you might generalize that all dogs are small. This is because your sample does not include Great Danes, Golden Retrievers, or German Shepherd dogs, so the generalization is incorrect. So you can use this skill to take in information and find where things are common to generalize, but it's important that you understand the sample of what you're looking at to put these items together. This example says that your generalization could be wrong if you're only looking at a specific sample of information. Generalizations are useful because they help you understand unifying concepts. They help you put things together and see commonality. However, be aware that there are almost always exceptions to generalizations. Just because you make a generalization doesn't mean that that is 100% concrete correct. One way to check whether a statement is a generalization is to find out whether the statement has exceptions. If it is basically true, but not always, it is probably a generalization. Also, look for clues, words, or phrases such as generally, as a rule, tends to, in general, or usually. These are items that are saying that most of the time, or in general, usually, you have something that is in common, but there might be an exception. There might be something that rules that out. Now we're going to use this map that shows the different types of plate boundaries, volcanoes, and earthquake activity specific to Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands to practice this skill. Practicing the skill. For each item, write G if the statement is a generalization, and write F if the statement is a fact rather than a generalization. So a fact is something that isn't going to have a kind of a way out, where a generalization has what's called that exception. So facts are facts, they're concrete, they're proven. Generalizations have these exceptions which would make them different than facts in that way. So let's look. Number 1, the Pacific Plate is almost all ocean. If you look at the Pacific Plate, you've got a number of islands that are in this region, but it's mostly ocean where the Pacific Ocean exists. We would probably say that that is a fact. The only exception that you could say would be those islands, but it says almost all, so it's already telling us that in the factual sense. Number 2, Africa has few earthquakes. Let's look at our picture again. If you look at Africa and you look at these circular dots from your map key, you can see that there's maybe one on this fault line in the Mediterranean or this northern portion of Africa, so that would be also considered a fact. Has few earthquakes. Even though it's not a specific number, it's still a fact because it's true. There aren't any exceptions to that. Number 3, earthquakes and volcanoes tend to occur in the same areas. So here you've got different types of plate boundaries. You've got volcanoes and earthquakes that seem to be around those boundaries. But if you look here in the Central America and South America area, you've got earthquakes that are happening a lot farther inland than actually right on the boundary itself. In the smaller sample size of what is the Central America region and the Caribbean islands, maybe you have that distinction, but you would probably say that this is in fact a generalization. Earthquakes and volcanoes tend to occur in the same areas. Yes, but there are some exceptions to that. That's why it's a generalization. We'd say that that's true, but look over here in North America. You've got an earthquake way up in the middle of the country here. You've got earthquakes that are separate from where these plate lines are in the different parts of the world. So there are exceptions to that. Normally it's true. Number 4, some areas have no earthquakes or volcanic activity. If you look at our map activity or our map, there are some areas that have none of this. Most of Africa, this northern portion of the Eurasia plate or Russia, most of Canada, as we just studied, don't have those same type of volcanic or plate tectonic or earthquake type activities. We could say that this is a fact as well. Earthquakes and volcanoes can happen under the ocean. Earthquakes and volcanoes can happen under the ocean for number 5. We look at our distinction or our map here. Under the ocean would be where these dots and triangles are showing up in this region. We know that in the Caribbean, a lot of those islands themselves are actually formed from volcanic activity that has now created this mountain range that extends from the Yucatan Peninsula. That's why those islands are where they are. We would say that that is also a fact. Number 6, earthquakes usually occur along plate boundaries. Now, just to remind you, if you are using the words such as generally, as a rule, tends to, in general, and usually, it's going to be probably designated as a generalization. Here you have earthquakes usually occur along plate boundaries. That is a generalization because, again, earthquakes can happen at different parts of the world. Number 7, plates are generally very large areas. If you look at the map here, you can see that the Pacific plate is very large, the South American plate is very large, the Nazca plate is very large, but here in the Caribbean, maybe you have these distinctions or exceptions that are relatively smaller in comparison to some of those other plates. So you could say that this is a generalization because you might have several of those distinctions. And it also says generally, it uses one of those vocabulary terms that give away, or those phrases that is a dead giveaway to something that is a generalization. Again, those terms for a generalization are generally, as a rule, tends to, in general, and usually. Anytime it's using generally, it's using the generalization word itself. That kind of is a dead giveaway to say what is a generalization. Let's apply the skill. Answer the questions based on information on the map. Number 1, make a generalization about earthquakes in Central America compared to another part of the world. Well, if we look at Central America, area that we're studying, and let's look at the previous study in chapter 5 and 6, we looked at North America. Where do you think more of those types of activities are happening? You've got the Caribbean plate, the Cactus plate, the Pacific plate here. There are 3 different plates or fault lines right in this region, and it looks like there's more happening in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean than there was in the region of North America. So let's make that distinction. Central America tends to, there's our phrase, tends to have more earthquakes than North America. Now, what would be the exception? Well, if you kept track over the course of a year and North America had about the same or maybe even more events than were in Central America, you could say, well, that was an exception. Normally, throughout each and every year, if you looked at every year statistics, Central America tends to have more. Especially if we're basing it on this map, it looks like there is more activity that's happening in this region than there is in North America. Number 2 says, make a generalization about the shape of plate boundaries. Now, if we're looking at the shape, I want you to take a look at the edges of each of these shapes. Are these straight lines? They look like a straight line. Are they jagged and rough? Are they rounded and smooth? If you had to make a generalization or a summary of what these different lines look like, what would you say they look like? Plate boundaries are usually, there's our key phrase, usually. I'm going to say and describe them as being jagged. They don't look very smooth. They don't look very straight. They have all sorts of different kinks and turns and jaggedness to them. Now, there are some exceptions. Obviously, that would make them a generalization. Here's a straight line, here's a straight line, here's a straight line, but mostly have this jagged or rugged type of shape between those different fault lines. Thanks for following along, and hopefully that helps you have a better understanding of how to make a generalization in terms of learning what it is, identifying those phrases, generally, as a rule, tends, generally, usually, applying that in terms of practicing it with the map information that's given, pointing out what's the difference between a fact and a generalization, and then being able to create those yourself. Thanks for following.